I think the waiting room is cleared out now, so let's go ahead and get started. We have our usual meeting today. We have Becky here with us, who'll give us the climate update in just a minute, and then do we know who from
NRCS
is joining? So hopefully someone from NRCS will join us as well to give us an update.
Carl's there.
Oh, Carl is here. Thanks.
Yeah, good morning.
Hi, good morning. Before we get started, I did want to give a quick shout out and share my screen. Okay. This is an exciting week for us in CWCB. We are hoping to release the comment draft of the water plan, the 2023 water plan, later this week. And I just wanted to take a few minutes and let everyone know that that's coming down the line. And I should be advancing my slides. So the water plan, we're focusing on 4 action areas. Each of these areas has a suite of actions around water conservation in the state. We have vibrant communities, robust agriculture, thriving watersheds, and resilient planning. And of course, a lot of these action items span across all these different areas, but just for the sake of organization, really focused on those 4 areas. The goal of the water plan is really to catalyze local action around water conservation and wise development of water resources. And so we really hope that the water plan will be available later this week on engagecwcb.org. There will be instructions on how to provide comments, but we really hope that you all will take a minute to visit the water plan, provide comments and suggestions, but also use the opportunity to make a commitment to take your own action on water. And also on Engage CWCB, there's an opportunity to share your stories from what's working around the state that we might be able to help support and bring to scale. So I just wanted to give a quick shout out to the water plan, which is, again, hopefully will be released later this week for public comment. And the public comment period will be open until September 30th. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Becky. And to give us our climate update. Do you want to try to advance the slides? If you can, I can do it for you from here. Oh, it's not. Switch, let's try again. There we go. Okay, I can do it from here.
Okay. Thanks everybody for joining virtually. It's very exciting being here in person. I highly recommend. So, sorry, I have a frog in my throat. I don't think I've been here since January of 2020, so it's very exciting to be back. And I'm going to give a Colorado climate update, where we've been and where we are and where we're going. So we're going to first look at water year to date, more just looking at what we saw in spring and in May. And I just realized I forgot to fill out a couple tables. So That's fun. Well, you'll see it. You'll see it when we get to it, and you'll realize how woefully unprepared I am. So this is looking at statewide precipitation for the March, April, May time period. Going back to 1895, the green shows each spring's precipitation for the state. The 1991 to 2020 average is the dark dashed line, which shows on average we get just over 5 inches. I've highlighted 2022 to show that it's at 3.83 inches. So we were drier than average. That ranked as our 23rd driest spring in that 128-year record. If you are interested in exploring these graphics here, the link is at the bottom, and this presentation will be shared by CWCB later. So moving on. Yeah, that's the table that's missing the things. Sorry about that. On the top is just a look at the country and how each state ranked for the spring time period for precipitation. So you see our 23rd driest there. You can see to the south of us, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, all ranking drier. And then the map on the bottom is the ranking just for May. So focusing on May, it was a lot closer to average. The dryness that really drove that ranking for the spring was April, which was extremely dry. And I'm sorry, I don't have the ranking for it. I will add that on for the CWCB presentation that's shared later. So I'll move on to the next slide. And looking at how March, April, May ranked across the state, and anywhere where you see the browns means that those areas were in the bottom 35th percentile of dryness for that record. As we get into the darker browns, which you can see particularly in Southwest Colorado over the San Juan Mountains, Northeast Colorado, really focused there over Logan County, and then a bit in Southeast Colorado. These are areas that ranked in the lowest 20th percentile or lowest 10th percentile. So extremely dry spring for those areas. And where you see the white, you're kind of in that near average range. And then the little spot of green we have there in Routt County is an area that was a little bit wetter than average for the spring period. Shifting over to temperature, this is looking at the March, April, May temperature over time for the entire state. So again, the red line shows every spring back to 1895, and the black dashed line is the 1991 to 2020 average. And spring of 2022 ended very slightly below that average. Although you'll notice, interestingly enough, that that average is pretty warm when you compare it to the older part of the record. So if you look at just the most recent time period, it's a little bit cooler than average. In fact, it's been our second consecutive cooler spring. But if you compare it to the entire record, it still ranks up there in that top 36th warmest spring in that 128-year record. And again, looking at the ranks on here, we have the spring rankings for all of the states on the top left. And so that 93rd coolest comes out as the 41st warmest for the entire state. And then if we, oh, sorry about that. If we just look at May, it comes in a little bit, not quite as warm, but still ranking higher. I don't know what's going on.
Blame it on the
Sorry about that. Okay, moving on. And looking at where those warm anomalies ended up across the state for the spring, most of those warm anomalies were in the southwestern portion of the state and over the San Juan Mountains. So particularly the San Juan Mountains for the spring was much drier and much warmer than average. All right, shifting over to talking about current conditions, and we'll be going over kind of currently where we are with temperature, precip, evaporative demand, soil moisture, vegetation before switching over to drought. Month to date precipitation across the state. So this is not exactly month to date, but through the morning of June 26th, anywhere where you see green across the state are areas that have gotten at least a half an inch of moisture. So area missing out the most is over there on the far western edge around Mesa County, Garfield County, where they've gotten less than half of an inch. But pretty much across most of the state, we've seen some good precipitation activity. The blue you see across the Eastern Plains, that diagonal blue swath that goes through Kiowa, Bent, and Prowers, was really from a couple of good events that passed through there. But overall in the Eastern Plains, we're seeing totals that are more than an inch for the month so far. And then over the San Juan Mountains, we've started to see that kickoff of monsoon moisture. And so we have a wide area there in Southwest Colorado that has gotten an inch or more of precipitation. Temperature wise, this is.
Can I interrupt you? Are you
Yeah.
gonna talk more about the monsoon later on in the presentation, or is this a good time to ask a question?
You can go ahead and ask a question. I'll let you know if I'm answering it later.
Okay. Just always exciting, I guess. Exciting when we hear that we have had some monsoon moisture. And I guess just typically, if we start together, does it keep coming? Can it be very variable? I know there's some years when we just feel like it's not come.
Yeah.
Right, we haven't got it at all, but
Yeah.
is this a good sign for the rest of the summer?
I think from what we've seen, the past 2 weeks have been really consistent, and we're still seeing it showing up in the shorter term forecasts and a little bit longer term outlook. Is that this is a good sign. It's not a guarantee, but right now it seems to be consistent that we're getting this moisture from the south, and it looks to still be more on the way. So you know how these summer thunderstorm events can be, they can be very hit and miss, but I take what I see as a pretty positive sign. So we'll move on from the precip.
Hey, Becky, this is Kevin. Can I ask a question really quick?
Yeah.
Kind of to pile on to that line of questioning there. Do you think the moisture we've gotten so far is the sign of just a typical monsoon type event, or is it from these specific hurricanes that we're just lucky that they were situated where they were?
Yeah, so that is a good question, and I haven't looked in detail at the what the monsoon onset, if that has the very specific guidelines for that have started, but I can say that yes, there has been some that's been coincidental and not necessarily the start of the monsoon. However, I do think that it can help with persistence. If you are really hot and dry now, that can inhibit that start of the monsoon. And so I think that even if this, what we've seen isn't all contributed to the monsoon or specifically monsoon moisture, that it can help really foster that monsoon onset, because we've already had the moisture and the higher dew points start kicking it off.
That's great news. I just, you know, I'm not the expert in the weather, but I feel like I don't ever remember a monsoon season starting here in the month of June. Am I wrong there? Or, I mean, does that happen? I always feel like it's sometime the second or third week of July or something like that.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you that typically when I think of monsoon season for Colorado specifically, I'm thinking late July is when it starts, you know, like a month later than what we're seeing it now. Officially speaking, especially for Arizona and New Mexico, they define the start date of the monsoon as June 15th. Regardless of when it actually comes in or what the dew points are looking like or what the flow is looking like. And so on the southern side of things, that is something that can happen more frequently and I wouldn't think is completely unprecedented for the southern part of our state. But I do agree that for Colorado, I think we do, the onset isn't necessarily paired with when we start getting the moisture from it. So
Thank you.
no problem. So we're looking at the temperature over the last 30 days, and we have seen above average temperatures across most of the state. There's that pink color, which means you're in that top 66th percentile. So just a little bit in that upper tercile of temperatures over the state. And then particularly going over areas of the San Luis Valley, the San Juan Mountains near the Four Corners, getting a little bit warmer than that, in that top 90th percentile, meaning that for the last 30 days, 9 out of 10 times it's cooler than this. And so we're seeing quite warm temperatures right now. All right, quick look through over at the standardized precipitation index for a few time periods. The standardized precipitation index, as a reminder, is just taking the precipitation for that time period and standardizing it compared to a normal, so that if you the progressively more anomalously wet you get, you're going to look at those greens and blues and purples. And then the more dry you get, you're looking at those droughty colors of yellow and orange and red. So short term, the last 30 days, SPI shows pretty much across the entire West, we're seeing those wet SPIs. And that's really a testament to what Kevin mentioned, is that we don't typically see this much moisture in June. We don't really usually see it start to kick off until July. And so that is why when you look down in La Plata County and surrounding areas, we're seeing a lot of those significantly wetter SPIs, but we're pretty much seeing them across the board across Western Colorado, and a little bit drier as you go east of the divide, particularly in the Arkansas basin, and then in far northeast Colorado as well. So I'm going to jump out to the 120-day SPI to show how short-term that benefit has been. So this is going back to the end of February. So we're including the extremely dry April that we experienced, and pretty much everywhere except for like one dot in Park County, we are seeing a lot of dry SPIs. There are some gray ones, and those are near normal, but really trickled throughout, we're seeing a lot of dry SPIs, some of the worst of them showing up over the northern Front Range and into northeast Colorado. And then extending out, this is looking at the 12-month SPI. So going back an entire year, again, our dry SPIs are dominating. We do have a few little bit wetter areas in northwest Colorado, the San Luis Valley showing up as extremely dry, the Front Range urban communities showing up, and the foothills as extremely dry, and out into northeast Colorado. And I'm sure Joel can attest to this, that Akron has been particularly painfully dry for the last year. All right, so shifting over, what has this meant for soil moisture? On the left, we're looking at soil moisture for the top 10 centimeters, so much closer to the surface. And then the right map is the top meter, so looking at a much deeper column. And so what we see on the left is very typical when you've got some excellent short-term precipitation. So this really lines up well with those 30-day SPIs, where we've seen a lot of recharge in the soils in Western Colorado. And so we don't have those dry soils where we've gotten the most consistent precipitation activity. And then as you go east of the divide, now we're starting to see those drier soils where they haven't gotten nearly as much precipitation. But again, that swath that was around Kiowa County, you can see there that it's a little bit better in that area. Over on the right side where we're looking at that top meter of soil moisture, now we're starting to see a little bit more dryness sprinkled out throughout the state. And the worst areas are really coming up as around Baca County and Los Animas County, up to the north near Lincoln County and Elbert County, and then in the far northern part of the state, particularly in Weld County. So these are areas where we are seeing that indication of longer term hydrologic drought that not even the short term can really recover, as you can see on the map on the left. So evaporative demand, now we're switching from looking at the soils in the ground to looking at the air above the ground. So EDDI is combining the temperature, solar radiation, wind, and humidity. And we're comparing this to the historical record for this time period. So if we look at 1 week ending June 22nd on the left, how does that compare to a typical 1 week in mid-June? And what we are seeing, where you see the reds and maroons right over eastern Colorado, is where we're seeing high evaporative demand. So this can be driven partially by the temperatures that we're seeing, lower humidities, higher winds, really driving that higher evaporative demand. And that means that that is moisture. If you have that moisture available in your vegetation and in the ground, the atmosphere is going to be taking that up. And it does that anyway in the summer. But when you see the reds and maroons, it's doing it a lot more than it typically would. Looking at a little bit longer time period, so the 3-month EDDI ending June 22nd. So this would really cover like late April, May, and then June. We are seeing that most of the state has seen higher evaporative demand than it typically would for that 3-month time period. And where we have the reds on the eastern plains, even that much higher. And then you see that maroon that is popping up over the Four Corners. So the one thing I will say is that when you have this, sometimes that can work against the moisture you're getting. And so that is something to keep in mind. Although if you shift back over to the map on the left and the short term, you can also see that plume of blue that's coming up from Mexico. And that really shows that when we've had that precipitation, we've also had the lower evaporative demand with it. So the precipitation that has fallen in that shorter term, we haven't lost as much of it. So that is good news. I'm going to look at a few sites across the state for COAGMET that show how the evaporative demand has accumulated this growing season. So what we're looking at here is our COAGMET site in Haxton, which is northeast Colorado. The black line is the normal accumulation of evaporative demand throughout the growing season. So this means if there were water available on a crop, this is how much would be lost to the atmosphere. And that black line is the typical amount. The gray lines are different growing season in the historic record, with the red being the highest in 2012, the green being the lowest in 2009, and the blue is our current season. And we've really been flirting with that maximum line in 2012 in Northeast Colorado. You know, we've had a couple of downward shifts, but mostly we're looking at record high evaporative demand so far this growing season for that area. Shifting to the south, this is looking at Avondale, which is in the Arkansas Valley in Southeast Colorado, just a little bit east of Pueblo. And what we are seeing here is the blue line did for a little bit match along with that record high evaporative demand very early in the season in May. And since then, they've had some good consistent moisture, cooler temperatures, and some help to really bring that line down closer to average. So the evaporative demand in that area is not nearly as high. Going west into the San Luis Valley, this is our center station, and they have also been showing record high evaporative demand. Although what's interesting about this station is you'll notice there's not as much separation between the average line and the record high evaporative demand line. There's not as much variability there. So even though it's record high, it's not too far from the average, but definitely higher demand than normal there for this growing season. And then going over into Cortez, Southwest Colorado, close to the Four Corners, we are seeing that they have also been near that record high evaporative demand for the growing season, just a little bit below their record high year of 2000, but still definitely higher evaporative demand than what is typical. All right, let's look at what the drought depiction looks like. We've got the U.S. Drought Monitor released last Thursday on June 23rd for conditions that were as of June 21st. So bear in mind that these maps do not take into account the precipitation that has fallen in the last week. That map will be released on Thursday this week. But what we see is dominant drought persisting throughout the Southwest and the West. So most of New Mexico really showing up with that D3, D4, and that's crept into southern Colorado, and a little bit more variable conditions in Colorado, which we'll zoom in on now. So currently, as of last Thursday specifically, about 43% of the state has been in severe drought or worse. So that's a D2, D3, or D4. And where we have the peach color is D1 moderate drought. And so that is the majority of the state, although the yellow, where is considered abnormally dry, not a drought category, covers some of our higher elevations east of the divide, crossing over Continental Divide into the northern mountains, our Front Range, and a couple of spots. And then we have this one glorious patch of nothing that covers about 1% of the state over Jackson County and Cameron Pass. These are the changes that we have seen over the last 4 weeks. So, approximately the time since we last met for the Water Availability Task Force. This is how things have changed. You can see those improvements made on the Eastern Plains where they've gotten some of the best moisture in late May and early June. There are a couple of areas that have seen some degradations where the yellow is in Western Colorado. We had made more degradations in early June, which were then reversed and became improvements when we saw some of that moisture in the last couple of weeks. And so that's where it just turns out gray because they were worse and then they were better. And so it just kind of averaged out. But that's how the changes have mapped out. I would expect that this week we will see further improvements over Southwest Colorado, where we have continued to see that excellent moisture coming in. There were many areas down there that got over an inch just in the last week. And so we will see more improvements on the drought monitor map this week in Southwest Colorado particularly. We are looking at some degradations too, possibly over Northeast Colorado where you see there's gray. We haven't made any deteriorations, but as you saw from some of the maps, we are seeing some deteriorating conditions up there, and possibly over portions of the Front Range. If we don't get ample precipitation for some of that area soon, we could see some degrading back from the D0 to D1. Let's get out the crystal ball and look at the future. Precipitation forecast for the next 7 days. On the left there, anywhere you see blue, that's pretty good. That means the area is forecasted to get about an inch or more of precipitation over the next 7 days. So if that forecast pans out, I don't expect it to be that widespread. You know how thunderstorms are in the summer. They're a lot more spotty. So some of the areas are going to get this. Some of the areas are probably going to miss, but overall, if we see this amount of activity, it's going to be pretty good news for a lot of the areas of our state. Unfortunately, a couple of the drier spots, I say drier in air quotes because they're still showing that they could get some precipitation, but there are probably areas that are going to miss out, and more likely than not, it'll be in the lower elevations close to the Four Corners and Utah, Colorado border, or up in Northeast Colorado where conditions are already drier. On the lower right, that map shows the precipitation anomalies for this time of year for that type of a forecast. So you can see that this would definitely be a wetter than average week with the exception of Northeast Colorado if this forecast pans out. Extending out to 2 weeks. So this is the 8 to 14 day outlook. This was released yesterday, so it's probably been updated today. But what we're looking at here from the Climate Prediction Center shows the likelihood of below average precipitation or above average precipitation on the left. So the brown is more likely to be below average precipitation, which starts to creep towards Western Colorado, but not really. And then we've got that swath of green that comes up from Texas, New Mexico, Mexico, where it's slightly enhanced likelihood of being above average precipitation, which covers most of our state. So that could indicate that we will see continued precipitation activity in the 2 week time period as well. On the temperature outlook on the right side, where you have the red, different shades of red, is the likelihood of warmer than average temperatures. So you see that bullseye showing up over Texas and coming up from the Gulf of Mexico, where they're expected, very confidently expected to see warmer than average temperatures. And then that extends northward through the Central Plains and could extend into the High Plains and our region. It's just maybe not as confident how far west those warm anomalies will extend, but it is more likely than not that we will have warmer than average temperatures continue. So the seasonal outlook, this was released a couple weeks ago and shows what the July, August, September time period looks like for precipitation on the left, temperature on the right. So in this instance, we see a lot of Colorado is in that brown category for precipitation, particularly Northeast Colorado. If you're detecting a hint of a trend here, I've been talking about Northeast Colorado quite a bit, and it looks to stay in that drier than average conditions, unfortunately. And then on the left hand of that map on the left, you see that little bit of above that covers Arizona. And while that doesn't extend into Colorado, it is a good indication that the models are still showing strong consistency in that monsoon pattern. And so while it's never as confident how that's going to translate into monsoon precipitation north of the Four Corners, it is a good indication of what they're seeing with the monsoon and could be better news for the southwestern part of our state. On the right side, temperature, we're looking at pretty much across the entire country. It is more likely than not that we will have those above average temperatures. And we have a bullseye over western Colorado. And that bullseye means that it is very likely that temperatures for the July, August, September time period will be warmer than average. This is a pattern that we have seen over the last few months. It's been pretty confident. It's panned out. That's where we've had a lot of our warm anomalies, and that is expected to continue. All right, El Nino forecast. We are still in our La Nina, and those conditions are expected to remain. If you look on the left, that is the likelihood of La Nina for each 3-month period, which would be the blue bar. Gray would be neutral conditions, and red would be El Nino conditions. So what is the probability of those three? And then the black line shows a 50% probability. And so the blue, the La Nina, remains above that 50% probability through the fall and into the winter months. The gray bars start to increase in probability after that. But really, we're starting to get into a time where there's a lot more uncertainty that's pretty far out. What you can gather from this is that it's likely that La Nina is going to stick around a little bit longer. So what does La Nina mean for the fall? These are the wonderful, I've shared them before, the climate risks maps from NOAA in Boulder. The risk of extremes during a La Nina, these are for the September, October, November time periods. On the left, we're looking at what is the increased risk for warm extremes or cold extremes during the fall. And the blue would be if there's an increased risk for cold extremes. The reds, oranges, yellows, which are in Colorado and are completely surround Colorado, is that during the fall in a La Nina, we are at increased risk for warm extremes, which is something that we have experienced the last 2 falls now, which were also La Ninas. So this would be the 3rd La Nina in a row for the fall going into the winter. What does that mean? I know you guys have all been very familiar with the term double dip La Nina, not as familiar with triple dip La Nina because don't really know what it means. Individual La Ninas we can analyze because we have a good sample size. 3 La Ninas in a row really rarely happens, so we don't have a lot to base comparisons on. On the right side, precipitation. What does fall precipitation look like during a La Nina? Increased risk of wet extremes would be green. Increased risk of dry extremes would be yellow, orange, red. And while Colorado only has a couple of yellow basins and mostly white, it's important to look at the entire region surrounding it and to see that for the most part, our area probably gets more increased risk of dry extremes, probably with the exception of Northwest Colorado, may not have as much of a risk. But overall, I would say we don't really get wet extremes during a La Nina fall, and we're more likely to get those dry extremes during the fall. So let's talk key takeaways from this presentation and some interpretation. Overall, spring was drier than average, slightly cooler than average. summer, we've started out warm, but we have had an active precipitation pattern. We've had that start to the monsoon, or like Kevin mentioned, from Pacific hurricanes into southern Colorado, particularly over southwest Colorado. Impacts from long-term drought do still remain. That's evident in streams, soils, vegetation. Evaporative demand has been variable, but overall has been higher than average for most of the state. Active monsoon pattern is expected to continue, which is good news. The bad news is that with the La Nina conditions that will continue into the fall and beginning of winter, that could put us more towards a warm and dry pattern. If we have this continued active thunderstorm pattern that we've had, that is going to help recharge the soils. It's going to improve drought conditions. But if the fall is warm and dry, that will offset that. That's going to worsen the drought conditions. And then we would be looking at starting another snowpack season with a deficit in the soils, and just a rerun of the beginnings of the last 2 years, which is hopefully not what we see, but just be prepared. I think that's my last slide.
Thank you. Can I ask you to speak a little bit more about the relationship between La Nina and the monsoon? I've heard some people say La Nina is kind of on pause right now, and that's why we're seeing the monsoon come up, or is that accurate, or what's?
So from what I recall, if you have a La Nina, it could, a stronger La Nina could strengthen the monsoon to the south, but maybe not extend as far north, so be as beneficial for us. But we have had a little bit of a weakening of the La Nina, but overall the La Nina conditions are still there. And so I think part of that La Nina pattern is why why the models have indicated that the monsoon will be good for like parts of Arizona and New Mexico, but more uncertainty as you go further north, because, how that translates the further north you go is a little bit more uncertain.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Any other questions for Becky?
Becky, hi, this is Kevin again. I'm wondering if you can go back to the slide that shows the 3-month seasonal forecast. I have to ask you about this. I've been looking at these seasonal outlooks for decades now.
Yeah.
And I am struggling to remember another time that I saw a seasonal forecast for temperatures that is this confident and this extreme. I may be forgetting another year or something, but it just seems outrageously high in confidence that we're going to have a hot summer. And I'm just curious if you agree with that, or do you think maybe the confidence here is a little overdone?
So a couple of thoughts. I agree. It does not often get this high. I have to come to the screen to count, but that above is 1, 2, 3, 4. You've got 4 categories, which puts you in the 60 to 70% likelihood of above average temperatures. And the way that their probabilities work, that means it reduces the likelihood of below average temperatures to almost 0. So what that means is they are, all the models have indicated, and they have very high confidence to have that high of a category for a seasonal outlook. And they've had it for the past few months. So I would agree, it's not something we often see. It's been very consistent, persistent in the seasonal outlooks. And to me, it's a big deal. The other thing I will say, though, is a reminder that these categories don't necessarily give you the magnitude of the warm anomalies. So we want to think that that bullseye means that that's where it's going to be the warmest. and that they'll be like record high, but that's not necessarily the case. This forecast would still pan out if it's just slightly above average temperatures. But I think my personal interpretation of this is that it's more likely that it would be very warm temperatures for this time period. And so I do consider that to be a big concern, even if you have the precipitation, that significantly above average temperatures are going to compete with that and limit the benefit of that. I agree. It's not every month you see a outlook this confident. Go ahead, Kevin.
Oh, I was just going to say thank you. I appreciate your comments on this. My boss, Becky, is going to be very disappointed in this forecast as she's renegotiating the Colorado River situation. I don't think this is going to help things, but
No,
I know you're just the messenger here.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Becky? All right, Becky, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, I'm going to hand it over to you, Carl, and I'm going to make sure that you are a host. And so you should be able to share your screen.
Yep, looks like that just popped up.
Great. Okay. Yep, we can see
Right,
it.
you guys can see that? Okay.
Yes, we can. Thank you so much.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Becky. So I'm going to kind of go through the format as we're most have done it most of the time throughout past, just kind of go through all the major basins, do a quick roundup of how the snowpack season ended up, at least as measured by SNOTEL, precipitation, our June, July stream flow forecasts, and reservoir storage, and just kind of run through all our major basins and then just do a statewide roundup. So I will go ahead and just jump right into northwestern Colorado here. So looking at snowpack in the combined Yampa White and Little Snake basins, when it came to the peak snowpack accumulation, these combined basins actually were on the lower end of many across the state, with not achieving a very near normal peak snowpack. But then once melt started, there were a few slight increases to that snowpack to kind of maintain it, leaving it to melt out at a very near normal time. Really not too long ago, pretty much now-ish, our final SNOTEL sites melted out. And in this basin, that's probably going to be driven largely by Tower up above Steamboat Springs to the east of Steamboat there, which is our pretty much always our highest accumulating SNOTEL in the state. Looking at water year precipitation, currently 95% of the median in those combined basins. We'll see kind of both following a lot of what Becky was just showing, and also reflected most specifically at our mountain stations, pretty big differences between northern Colorado and southern Colorado over the last month or so. But things have really dried out in the combined Yampa White and Little Snake over the last month or so. But on a water year basis, just a little bit below the normal. Moving over into the combined Laramie and North Platte basins, definitely accumulated a bit more snow, ended up pretty near normal peak there, and then also received a bit more snow from some of those late May storms that we saw in a lot of our northern mountains. We'll see this definitely in the South Platte. The Arkansas headwaters did pretty well with that. And the other thing to take note of as we go through all these snowpack graphs is really how steep this melt curve is in the beginning. And then in some of the northern basins that received some boosts to snowpack in May, it kind of softened that curve for a few reasons, but definitely started with really quick melt rates up in Northwest Colorado. And then it slowed down a bit, but this is something to really pay attention to when we get down into Southwest Colorado in particular. Looking at water year-to-date precipitation in the Laramie and North Platte, currently right at 100% of the median value. And this is worth reiterating. Most folks have probably heard it before, but when we recently switched from the 1980 to 2010 time period as our quote normals standard to the 1990 to 2020, we also switched all of our metrics to representing the median instead of the average. For a long time, we've been doing median for snowpack, but now we have been using the median as our official average for stream flow, reservoir storage, and precipitation as well. So there will be a bit of a shift there. But a lot of our products we do, such as the interactive map and others, we do have the average still available for comparison. Just something to keep in mind as we're looking at all of this data. Looking at reservoir storage, not too much in these basins, but not too bad. Elkhead just slightly above the normal value, Stagecoach a little bit low, Yancolo about 60% of normal storage. Going on into stream flow forecasts, another just quick note at the beginning here. For this presentation, I decided to just include our June, July forecasts with the exception of the Rio Grande, which is June through September forecasts. I thought it'd maybe be a little more relevant to just look at the second half of our forecast season, because that's where we're seeing the most dramatic differences and really what we're going to be expecting the most for the coming summer as opposed to what happened in April and May. But really not too bad compared to other parts of the state. You can see the North Platte, very near normal there. Unfortunately, that water leaves the state pretty quickly and doesn't come back. Some of our other major points, the Elk River right there, just slightly below normal forecast. Same for Yampa at Maybell, so can still expect, a fair amount of water coming down those streams for the rest of the summer. Again, at least compared to much of the other state, still far from above normal forecasts. Here's just kind of looking at a map. Another major one I didn't mention here, the White River near Meeker, our 50% chance of exceedance forecast is at 73% of normal. But again, Yampa at Maybell, Elk River near Milner, just slightly below normal there. Moving down a little south into the main stem Colorado River Basin. Looking at the snowpack, really it was kind of the further south in the state we move is kind of a boom or bust season. You see these periods of really dramatic accumulation and then drier periods, and this gets more pronounced the further south we go. But kind of averaged out throughout the season, a relatively normal snowpack accumulation and ablation curve. Again, you can see these faster than normal melt rates, but then kind of buffered out by some late May new snow accumulation. That has left the water year-to-date precipitation fairly similar to the previous basins we looked at 97% of the median. Going on to reservoirs here. Obviously, this isn't every major reservoir in the basin, just kind of a smattering, but not doing too bad. Again, generally reservoir storage is doing much better in the northern Colorado basins than in the southern basins. And I just got a note, it says I have an unstable internet connection, so hopefully you can still hear me there. This is working. But we'll look at the long-term time series here, going back to 1990 to kind of put things in a bit more perspective. Some of the really good news for reservoir storage in the Colorado is here at the end, you can see there really has been a nice steady increase in those storages throughout the current water year. Whereas late in 2021, we were looking at some of the lower values we've seen since the early 2000s, after that really dry period of low storages around 2002 there. So definitely some good news there with those storage values getting closer and closer to the normal. Looking at our June, July stream flow forecasts, definitely looking at below normal values for this current month, pretty close to last month as well as July. Really very, very low probabilities of many of these rivers getting above the median value for the June, July period. Here you can see way up in the headwaters, Colorado River below Lake Granby this is our 30% chance of exceedance value here is right at our normal line. But really most of these forecasts being to the left of this gray line are looking at below normal values. And we'll take a look at what that basin-wide normal is here next. So volumetrically, all these forecasts average out to 78% of normal across the Colorado River Basin as a whole. And here along the main stem, not aside from that Granby forecast, not very big geographic differences we're looking at necessarily, but you can kind of start to look around the edges of this map and look into the future of this presentation and kind of see how things deteriorate the further south we go. Moving over into the South Platte River Basin and the Northern Front Range. Kind of an interesting late winter and spring here. You can see late March area, we were pretty near normal snowpack and then kind of went through a bit more of a dry period, some melt, a little accumulation. Didn't achieve a near normal snowpack peak here, but did later in May get a pretty substantial boost in snowpack there. So while we didn't see the peak up here, this late May snow accumulation is still adding quite a fair amount of water into the system, leading to a pretty near normal melt out date here a couple of weeks ago. And all of this, combining both our rain and snow since October 1st, has left the South Platte Basin right at 100% of median water year-to-date precipitation. So not too bad there. Moving on into reservoir storage. Again, I won't go into too many specifics here. There's tons and tons of different storage facilities across the South Platte. So I'll kind of take a look at how we're looking at the basin all combined. For quite some time, really the last several years as a whole, the South Platte has been on the high end of reservoir storage, clearly with some ups and downs over the normal value here. But we have seen kind of the opposite from the Colorado in this current water year, a pretty steady decline, finally dropping the total storage in the South Platte down to below normal values in the first time over a year. But again, in the big picture, still not sitting terribly with respect to storage. Moving into our June, July stream flow forecasts. As I've been mentioning several times with respect to geographic differences across the state, with at least the mountainous regions of the South Platte being very north-south oriented, we can certainly see that trend here. With all these forecasts on the main stem South Platte here, starting up in South Park and moving down through the Front Range towards the plains, largely centered around 75% of normal for the remainder of our, what we'd commonly consider the primary snowmelt driven stream flow period. And then as you move into subbasins further to north, things are improving slightly, pretty similar for Clear Creek at Golden, and then kind of just improving as you move into the subbasins of the Northern Front Range, through Boulder Creek, South Boulder, Big Thompson, with the Poudre up there, our furthest north basin. I believe this is forecasted to have the most plentiful stream flows in the state relative to normal values, at least with respect to a larger river. And again, here putting it on the map, you can see that geographically, everything coming out of South Park and then down on through the main stem, South Platte here, south of Denver, all in the 70% of normal range, 70 to 80, excuse me. And then kind of improving just the further north you go. So moving down into southwest Colorado, we'll start to see a lot of these kind of longer term trends, but also some positive trends popping out with the recent precipitation, as Becky covered quite well. Kind of our snowpack wrap up here. Ended up with pretty near normal snowpack accumulation. Kind of maintained near that peak for quite a while, some small ups and downs. But in all these coming southern basins, at least the Gunnison and the next two, you'll really see there wasn't that benefit from the late May snow accumulations, just a little bit blip here in May. Not dramatically increased snow melt rates, but certainly faster than normal. And then a little bit of later accumulation here, kind of. And the way these graphs are calculated, it's not necessarily later accumulation explicitly. A lot of times the way this tail pans out here to end closer to normal can be driven by higher elevation sites that just happen to hold the snow a bit longer than lower elevation sites. So moving on into precipitation, we're really going to start to see some of the benefit of recent storms that Becky was discussing, which is really, really great to see across all of Southwest Colorado, where really over the last 3 years, without question, it has been needed the most. So we can see in the last couple of weeks here, kind of two periods of storms, adding several inches of precipitation into the system, leaving us at 105% of the median water year to date. Going into reservoir storage, definitely reservoir storage is also decline across southern Colorado as a general rule, particularly in the Gunnison and our furthest southwest basins coming out of the southern San Juans. But obviously a big one to look at here is Blue Mesa Reservoir, the largest in the state. Looks to be sitting between 55 and 60% of the median storage right now, which I know is without question some of the lowest we've seen since it first filled. I didn't check the actual fluctuations over the last couple months specifically, but I believe it was last November, Blue Mesa was at the lowest value observed since it first filled. Believe in maybe the late 50s, early 60s, could be, please don't quote me on that, but and I won't dive too deep into it, but Kevin kind of touched on it, and I'll touch on it a bit at the end, but I'm far from the expert on the topic. But it was in the news quite a bit lately with the Bureau of Reclamation basically needing all 7 Colorado River Basin states to basically to use less water. I believe it was something in the range of reductions of 2 to 4 million acre feet over the coming 18 months. And we already have seen impacts. Last year, a lot of water was drawn down out of Blue Mesa, Flaming Gorge, and Navajo reservoirs to help supplement Lake Powell to maintain the power production pool. And then again, quite a bit more water out of Flaming Gorge this year. So When it comes to reservoir management in the Colorado River Basin, it'll be something to keep a close eye on, really over the coming years, and who knows what will happen beyond that. So looking at our time series here again, going back to 1990, we can see there have been increases, again, similar to the Colorado, basically since the beginning of the water year. But before that, across the whole basin, I believe it was the lowest values since that 2002 drought. Whoops. And again, Blue Mesa itself, the largest basin or reservoir in the state, was actually below that 2002 level for a period. But if nothing else, certainly good to see those increases. I know they've been pretty much having absolute minimum flows coming out of Blue Mesa and down through the Black Canyon. At least last time I checked, it's probably been a couple weeks. So helping to improve that storage a little bit. Going on into our June, July stream flow forecasts. Taylor Park Reservoir currently has the most plentiful, but for the most part in the Gunnison, uniformly well below normal forecasts for the remainder of the summer here. And again, connected to quite a few things, but a lot of that is due to the earlier than normal stream or snow melt that we saw across much of the state, or much of this portion of the state, excuse me. You can see our major pour point here for the Gunnison Basin at Grand Junction. Forecast for just a meager, looks like a little over 55% of median volumes. And that in combination with what we see for like the Colorado at Cameo and other major tributaries. I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but I know the Lake Powell inflow forecasts are certainly not the most encouraging for this year either. Looking at it spatially, similar to our view of the Colorado, again, you can kind of see this north to south trend just get kind of these forecasts and stream flows get less and less plentiful as we move further south. Again, kind of up in the headwaters, this is our Taylor Park Reservoir forecast being by far the highest, and then just kind of getting drier and drier as we move south with Uncompahgre, Tamichi Creek, some other key tributaries there. Moving further into our combined basins of far southwest Colorado, here we're really seeing that pattern of snowpack become most apparent, where the peak was actually at a fairly close to normal snow water equivalent depth, but occurred about 3 weeks earlier than normal. Aside from a couple little blips, definitely once it started melting, it melted out pretty quick, ending up here near our earliest observed meltout date, which if I had a live map, I'm guessing that was likely 2002, but very, very early meltout date. And here, and even more so in the upper Rio Grande, definitely the fastest melt rates we have observed on the SNOTEL record. So pretty striking statistic there, resulting from a variety of factors. The good news, again, have started to receive some of that precipitation. And so I guess all we can do is hope that keeps coming, because it's definitely been a very, very dry several months, basically since about April 1st, aside from a few accumulations. Very, very dry couple months in Southwest Colorado until very recently here. And that has left these basins at 90% of the median water year precip. So I went ahead and for this and the Rio Grande added in our time series graphs of soil moisture. And for anyone who's seen these before, we do always try and mention that we do consider this data to be provisional. We currently don't have it as actively quality controlled as we would like, but So, there can be a few more quirks in this, but at a glance, most of these ups and downs do coincide well with snowmelt pulses and precipitation events. But really the good news here is this recent precipitation has brought our soil moisture in those basins, in the mountains specifically, from near record low levels here several weeks ago back up to above the median value, which is encouraging to see. Going into reservoir storage, kind of across the board, Trout Lake Reservoir, kind of near Telluride, has above the median storage, but pretty small body of water there. So I will just jump into our time series. Really here, you can start to see the effect of this multi-year drought really jump out. Here since late 2019, you can kind of see what looks like these little clusters of dots are what would usually be increases from snowmelt runoff. There's 1 year, 2 years, and 3 years in a row where the reservoir storages kind of stabilized for a little bit, but really have been looking at several years of net decline in reservoir storage, unfortunately. Going on into our stream flow forecasts, fortunately the relatively small Mancus at Mancus here is kind of throwing off the scale of the graph, but if you look at kind of the clusters of our range of different exceedance probabilities for these forecasts, largely clustered around, I believe it's a little over, this might even be less, might be around 25% of normal. We'll see on the next slide here, but basically with both the very early snowmelt and those warm, dry, windy conditions continuing to dry out soils over the last few months, looking at very, very meager stream flows for the June, July period. So here we go. Looking at the combined volumes from all these basins, just 26% of the median value stream flow and coming out of Southwest Colorado. So definitely low flows, and can only anticipate that is likely going to continue through the summer, just largely dependent on the remainder of the monsoon season. So hopefully we keep this rain coming, would be very, very beneficial. Going into the upper Rio Grande Basin, very similar story, but even a little bit more dramatic with respect to the snowpack here. Again, you can see just once the snow melt started, just an extremely steep melt out curve, leaving our snow-tell sites, aside from some increase there from those May storms after they'd all melted out, but more or less snow-tell melting out about a month earlier than normal, which left fairly high stream flow levels in April and May. Then obviously the flip side to that is very, very low stream flow values for June and July. On to the good news is, as we saw in one of those maps that Beck showed, where there's the big plume of blue kind of coming up from Mexico into New Mexico, and the Colorado portion of that, basically you could have thrown an outline of the Rio Grande Basin over that, and that's what you would have been looking at. So definitely some great increases in precipitation over the last several weeks, finally bumping that water year to date precip up to 99% on the median. So really some great news on that front. And this really jumps out looking at our soil moisture graph here. And even going back all the way through the water year, particularly around starting in December, very, very near minimum observed stream or soil moisture values throughout the entire water year, right up until these several inches of precipitation have fallen in the mountains, really boosting the soil moisture up there, which is a huge benefit to that basin. Going on into reservoir storage, we've just got a handful of individual storage facilities at above normal conditions currently, and we will jump on into our time series. Quite a bit different from the combined South Basin, Southwest basins that we just looked at least with respect to the last couple years. We see this one peak back in kind of around the beginning of water year 2019, it looks like. But then over the last 2 years or so, been some ups and downs, but it hasn't gone as dramatically below normal as we've seen in other basins. Looking at the forecasts, very, very similar to what we saw in our previous basins, slightly better, I believe. But in the big picture, that early snow melt, early and fast snow melt really depleted the snow out of the mountains. So the fair amount of water has come through the system, but looking at this, this is actually, as I mentioned in the beginning, the June through September period. So through pretty much the whole rest of the summer, definitely anticipating well below normal stream flows across the Rio Grande. You can kind of see further up north in the basin, we've got one at 42%, but in general, largely clustered in that mid 30% of normal range, as is represented by our basin-wide number there. Okay, into our final major basin, the Arkansas, ended up with geographically an interesting basin compared to other ones, with conditions very commonly being quite different in the headwaters. Up north of Salida towards Leadville compared to down in the southern Sangre de Cristos, but ended up with a relatively near normal snowpack peak. Did observe that pretty fast snow melt, but then what's most unique about this basin for some of our more southern ones is did actually get quite an additional boost in snow from those late May storms, which I believe was primarily accumulated in those headwater areas, but certainly helped contribute to the main stem Arkansas above Pueblo at least. So currently, Arkansas Basin is looking at 96% of median water year-to-date precipitation. See a little bit of boost from recent rainstorms in the mountains, but certainly nothing compared to its two neighbors further to the west. Reservoir storage is holding on pretty well so far in the Arkansas. Very similar pattern over the last 3 to 4 years as in the upper Rio Grande, with kind of a big drop, but over the last couple of years, some ups and downs, but largely maintaining at those slightly below normal reservoir storages. And finally, moving into our so again, we are back here to just the June, July forecast, but the patterns would be presumably fairly similar to if these were carried out through September. Those are just tricky because so much of that depends on the monsoon situation. But some of the, again, following the trend we've seen throughout the state, some of the more northern forecasts are for the most plentiful values. Chalk Creek contributing to the Arkansas Salida here, have some of the higher values at our 50% chance of exceedance level. Little lower the Arkansas Pueblo, and then definitely getting into much lower stream flow values resulting from the tributaries coming out of the Sangre de Cristos and then flowing east. Again, it's always nice to look at the map just to see these spatial patterns, with some of our northern forecasts being more plentiful on down here to Pueblo. And then our more southern forecasts within the Arkansas Basin definitely looking much lower for the June-July period. So getting into some of our statewide numbers, again, as always in Colorado, being a headwater state as we are, it's generally most important, at least for water users, to be paying attention to their individual basins, because as we've seen this year, these differences can be quite dramatic. But statewide ended up with below normal total snowpack peak. But again, once it levels out, we see some melt, some accumulations, melt and accumulations, really all throughout the spring period. So it's always good to keep in mind again that those are adding net water to the system, which is a good thing. With the final melt out at our SNOTEL stations ending up at a relatively near normal time frame not too long ago. Water year-to-date precipitation across the Colorado mountains, just barely below normal at 97% of the median. And again, you can really see a lot of these temporal patterns that were very dramatic in Southwest Colorado kind of even out. Obviously, this big storm over the new year, but then kind of starting in late February, relatively steady increases averaged across the state. So looking at a map, after all these kind of spatial and temporal differences, actually fairly tightly clustered water year-to-date precipitation across the state, ranging from a low of 90% of normal in the combined San Miguel, Dolores, Animas, and San Juan basins, up to a high of right at 100% of normal up in the combined Laramie and North Platte basins. So the next one we have, this is looking at individual SNOTEL sites for our month-to-date precipitation. And it looks like this is so June 1st through June 26th. You can really see a lot of the trends that we have been discussing, where it's a pretty much a pretty stark difference right across this north-south line within the state, with really all of the mountains of southern Colorado. Aside from one, looks like we've got one point here that we need to take a look at the data, but you can clearly tell, especially in the central San Juans, received a ton of precipitation, southern Sangres, all the way up through the Grand Mesa, with a couple exceptions, West Elks, and then pretty much most of the mountains in the northern state receiving below normal month-to-date precipitation. Reservoir storage. Again, I know I've been mentioning this when I present pretty regularly, but again, it's also good to, in addition to a lot of what Becky presented, this can kind of be a proxy for what's been going on with our longer term multi-year drought, with a lot of these reservoir storages across southern, southwest Colorado in particular being fairly steadily depleted over the last several years, with the Arkansas and the rest of the basins of northern Colorado doing quite a bit better, with pretty significant gaps in between. So here we've got our time series. So this is a summation of total acre feet is what we're looking at here. So this most pronounced green line here is looking at total volumetric reservoir storage in the state, as a difference from the median, and then all of our individual basins. So we can see this year definitely in a pretty substantial deficit statewide, with that mostly being driven by the Gunnison here in black and our combined southwest basins in this kind of dark purplish color here. Looking, here's a map of our June, July stream flow forecasts. Again, this has sure been pretty clear throughout the presentation, but really that early and fast snow melt, as well as other environmental conditions contributing to very, very low forecasts for the latter half of our primary snowmelt runoff season here across southern Colorado, and then just more or less improving as you get further north, with most plentiful being in the Laramie and North Platte, as unfortunately is better news for Wyoming and on downstream than for many Colorado water users, at least. And this one, that is my mistake. That is an outdated one. So looking at our most recent surface water supply index, sure, no surprises here, just kind of looking at the general trends. With our SWASEs being very low, with many of them being less than -3 across Southwest Colorado and that extremely dry category, and then just largely improving as you move northward across these subbasins. So just to generally wrap things up, snowpack exhibited relatively near normal peaks across the state. If they didn't, some of the northern basins actually had a lower than normal net peak, but they did have some of those later additional snow accumulations, which helped even those out, as well as moderate the snow melt rates by not only adding more water to the system, but adding some clean, fresh white snow, which is going to reflect more of the sun's energy, which is opposite of what we saw in southern Colorado with no new snow accumulations. Some of the most plentiful dust on snow conditions we've seen since that monitoring has began. Also warm, windy, all of these things really contributed to pretty incredibly fast melt rates across the mountains of the southern San Juans, as well as the entire Rio Grande Basin. Good news for those basins, again, June precipitation is really strongly favored southern Colorado, with many of those stations receiving 200 up to 600 or even more % of normal June precipitation so far, accounting for perhaps 2 to 4 inches at individual sites up in the mountains, which is a huge benefit to these regions, which have been extremely dry for the most part over the last several years. And we have, as I showed in a couple of those graphs, observed that to considerably improve soil moisture conditions, which is also good news. Hopefully will be a benefit to wildfire concerns. Time will tell there. Currently with the declines in the South Platte, no major river basins are holding above normal reservoir storages. And as I will leave for the most part to other experts on the matter, I don't know if Kevin or others may have more details, but I've just seen it in the news quite a bit that likely looking at some reductions in water use. I'm not sure what regulatory authority may come down, but with record low levels in Lake Mead and Lake Powell, really looking at some long-term concerns and considerations for water usage in the entire Colorado River Basin as it goes across the west. Finally, stream flow forecasts for this June-July period. For the Rio Grande, we were looking at June through September, but really huge differences in southern Colorado compared to northern Colorado, with very minimal stream flow anticipated coming out of much of southern Colorado for this June-July period, driven by snowmelt, and then time will tell any impact that summer precipitation may have on that. And that is all I have for now, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Carl. I really appreciate it. I think Tracy here had a question for you.
Carl, thank you. I had two questions. Number one, your time series graphs all have the small graph on the bottom part. What are we supposed to take from that? I just keep looking at it and wondering what it's supposed to show us.
So are you referring to with the snowpack and precipitation, or these?
Yeah, those guys have it like that. What
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so all this is so these are a relatively new product for us within the last couple of years. So when you pull these up online, these are interactive charts. So to answer your question here first, all this is it lets you select what time period you're looking at. So it's got these bars and you can click and drag these bars. If you wanted to zoom in on big periods of increase, you can just drag these bars and it'll change the time frame that the graph is looking at. So basically that's just an interactive control you can use to kind of narrow the time frame the graph is showing.
Yep.
And then just the other interactive component for anyone who isn't aware, you can also compare to any year on the period of record by scrolling through here. So, you know, if you wanted to look at other exceptionally dry years or other exceptionally wet years, you know, you could look at a 2012 or 2002 for dry years, or say a 2019 for a really wet year. But yes, so that's, yeah, these are basically just controls, but very, very good question. I hadn't thought of that, but I could see that being confusing at a glance.
Thank you. And then just one last question. Is there any way that the stream flow forecast you're showing can consider the monsoon moisture? And I guess another way of asking that is, you know, some of those Southwest stream flow forecasts are so low. Is there any chance that the monsoon moisture bumps that up to levels that aren't so well below the normal?
Yeah, it certainly can. And it's really great to see this moisture coming in here in late June to help and see that increase in the soil moisture values, because as Becky mentioned, and you know, Kevin was asking about that, we're really just at the beginning of what we'd commonly consider the monsoon season. So with those soil moistures being increased now, additional precipitation throughout the rest of the summer is definitely more and more likely to make it to the stream channels and increase that. Our NRCS stream flow forecasts, as well as the National Weather Service River Forecast Centers, don't necessarily include monsoon predictions as a consideration in their multi-month forecasts. Well, I'll just stick with NRCS, not the CBRFC or the Arkansas River Forecast Center. But we do not consider that in our standard April, July. So folks will probably be best off looking at some of those shorter term outlooks from the National Weather Service. They do 7 to 10 day outlooks that actually do include the upcoming weather forecasts that can kind of show what might be happening in the short term. But those, you know, the monsoon predictions and those multi-month climatic outlooks can just be so uncertain. We currently do not use them in any of our NRCS forecasting.
Can I add something to that too?
Yes, please.
That if you're talking about monsoon rains versus what snowpack can do on these streams, I think you can see temporary bumps and increases, but unless you're getting like a September 2013 event, every time I talk, man, that frog wants to come back in my throat. You're not going to see the level of recovery on those stream flows that you would see from a decent snowpack year. So I think Carl's right in that if we had this continued monsoon, you're going to see those bumps on the streams. But I think that, and tell me if you disagree, Carl, but the way I see it is the snowpack melting kind of defines that base flow that we'll enter into. And so it's more than likely that you'll get those bumps, but that the base flow is going to go back to being more representative of what happened in the spring than what happened in the summer.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. You know, with respect to the total volumes we're going to be looking at, I would anticipate kind of what we've been observing and the forecast to be mainly driving it. You know, I I 100% agree with Becky that these, these early rains, when I was mentioning buffering the soil moisture, that I would picture being basically allowing us to maybe see those short-term increases with say a week of precipitation or something. Whereas if we didn't have those, pretty much all that rain is just going to be absorbed into the soil structure, and we're really not going to see it in the streams at all. But it is allowing an increased possibility of it making to the stream flow. But as far as the total volume we're going to see, now through basically next snowmelt runoff, I wouldn't anticipate it to increase the net volume too dramatically. But particularly in Southwest Colorado, we will be more than happy to take any additional stream flow we do get out of the summer.
Okay, thank you. Makes sense.
Any other questions for Carl? All right, Carl, thank you so much. That was so informative. It is so interesting to do that basin by basin deep dive.
No problem.
And
Oh, no, stop.
yeah, you should. There we go. Now we wanted to just open it up. It's been a little bit since we've had the opportunity to go around and hear some on the ground observations from around the state. So I would really appreciate if any of you who are joining us from those basins that we just heard Carl share about, or any others wouldn't mind. Oh, sorry, I thought I saw a hand up, but it was gone. If anybody wouldn't mind jumping off mute and sharing with us a little bit about what you're seeing in your basin, or a little bit about what you might be concerned about.
This is Jordan Soldano at Denver Water. I can jump in. Yeah, our reservoirs right now are currently at about 91% full. Normal for this time of year is 97%. And then our June demands have been pretty close to our expected levels, much closer than earlier in the season when we all kind of saw that early start to the irrigation season. But yeah, other than that, not much to share.
All right, thank you so much. Any other providers on the call who wouldn't mind sharing?
Hello, this is John Orr from the city of Thornton.
Hi, John.
Howdy. Our production is through the roof since the cool weather earlier in the year. As of Monday, our year-to-date production is 14.17% above 2021. Storage is at 96.6%, which is really pretty normal for us. We usually fill early in the year. And Stanley Lake filled, woohoo. Of course, it's dropping now because everybody's demand is going through the roof. So that's kind of it.
So what's going on in northern Front Range that's not going on in Denver? Why is demand higher in Thornton, I wonder?
I guess just to clarify, our June demands have been a little bit above average. I was sort of factoring in the hot, dry weather when I said that.
Yep.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Jordan. Anyone else on the line wouldn't mind sharing?
Is Joel Schneekopf on?
No, we had a smaller crew this time around. Wonder if people headed out early for the 4th of July weekend. All right. Well, with that, we'll go ahead and close a little early unless anybody has any final things they want to share. But please consider coming to join us in person next month. We'll continue to go forward with the hybrid meetings. And would love to see you all in person if you want to join. Otherwise, we will always have the remote option available as well. So thanks all. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesdays.
Thanks, we'll see you.